Hello guys, today I want to talk to you about how you can improve your Minecraft builds by incorporating 4 major concepts. Now this is a bit of a sequel to my planning video, and we're keeping with the same project here, but you don't need to have watched that one in order to get this one. I will give you though a quick fly around to show you some things that have changed, including the laying out of a big farming area on terraformed land, some new windmills. I have changed a bunch of the wool around the town to stone and in the castle as well, and I've even started working on a couple of interiors, like this one for the church. Now, the 4 concepts that I want you to keep in mind are movement and motion, density and empty space, terraforming, and culture and economy. Now, starting first with real movement and implied motion. Real movement are things you can add to your Minecraft world that will physically move around. These are things like mobs, like that pig down there. You can put in villagers, you can do moving water, so a small river or something like that, or a fountain. Campfire smoke and fire, torches, candles, mine carts if you have a more industrial or mining themed build. You could do waving leaves if you're using shaders, or you can use spore and cherry blossoms to have dripping particles everywhere. Pale oak leaves in the new update will do the same. And finally, you can have something like dripping water or lava. Implied motion, on the other hand, are things that are not literally moving in your world, but that imply that something has just happened or is in the middle of happening. So this is something like a door left open or a fence gate. You can put in flags and banners that are flying in the wind. Having windmills and water wheels that look like they're in the middle of a cycle of rotation. Having wagons and wheelbarrows in the middle of the road, or even having an arrow stuck in a target. You can put in some animal droppings in an animal pen to show that the animals are living beings and they are going through the same cycles that we are. You can do something like a spill or an accident. You can also use something like glass in order to look like smoke or water. Back in the day, we would have used cobwebs to look like smoke, but nowadays it's more common to use stained glass. And putting boats, big elaborate boats in the water near a town or village can also add to implied motion. The second thing I want to talk about is density and empty space. Now this is something that I'm trying to improve specifically from Regensburg. Regensburg was a really big build of mine and that one that I have a lot of love for, but Regensburg is super full and super compact. There's not a lot of empty space. And the issue with that is that you don't have a lot of contrast. Empty space is really good for giving you contrast, obviously, but it's also good for negative space. Without that empty air around the castle on either side, it doesn't stand out as much. Empty space also gives you a place to rest your eyes. Especially if you're building something that's really detailed or colorful, people will get tired of looking at it after a while and they want some place to rest their eyes. For instance, this is a plum tree grove, so this is a little orchard and it's a pretty visually busy thing, but this one is going to be just an empty animal pasture with a couple of cows, and this way there is a contrast of something that is very visually busy and something that is very visually empty. Empty space can also give you room to see your builds properly. So again, one of the issues with Regensburg was that it was really hard to photograph any of the stuff that I had built because everything is really close together. So when I did the video for the hospital or the Temple of Ekna, I couldn't really take good screenshots. And obviously it's not just about screenshots, but in having this empty space, you can maintain your sightlines and you can maintain a sense of openness. Empty space also implies potential for growth. So even though there are a bunch of houses here, there's also a bunch of farmland. And you can imagine that if you came back in 100 years, maybe there would be twice as many houses and the farmland would have moved to over there. It would have slowly gotten pushed out of the city as it starts to grow. Talking about density, one of the other lessons I learned from Regensburg and from, honestly, a lot of my other builds like Newport and Sarneville is that you have to naturally build up your density. It's not enough to just put a big town or a big castle in the middle of nowhere. You really need to build up an idea of, okay, so there's a castle here and there's a town, which means that there have to be suburbs and things supporting that castle and supporting that town. If one of your issues is, I don't have enough space for all of the professions I want to put in, say I don't have space for like a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, you can put some of those in the town outside. And you can naturally build up to some of the more important professions through density. So obviously you don't want to have something like a huge forest surrounding a city on all sides, and that's one of the issues with Newport. But the other good thing about densities is that it lets you create stories about little micro communities. Over there, we have the bathhouse, and that has its own little enclosure. And over here, we have a church that services the people who live out here in this farming community. I'm thinking of potentially doing a small dockyard somewhere over there after some terraforming, and that's going to give me the opportunity to do yet another small community. So you can tell these stories about these little places that are starting to pop up, not just as one huge like wave or one huge sea of farmland, but as different little spaces that are all servicing the greater town or the greater castle. Speaking about terraforming, I want to separate my thoughts about terraforming into two distinctions. So the first one is extraneous. I'd say extraneous terraforming is all the stuff that you do. For instance, in my first episode, I talked about how this used to be a flat plateau with a bunch of big weird spikes on it. When I came in, I removed all those weird bits like the cliffs and all those tiny ponds and stuff, and I also changed the biome using the Axiom mod. And you can do this without any mods. You can go through and use the fill biome command, but that's something that people in your world can't naturally do. That's stuff that you are doing. On the other hand, your diegetic terraforming is going to be stuff that the people in your world are doing. So there is a kind of large open plain here that used to be forest. And it's not just that I wanted it to be a farmland, it's that the people living here wanted it to be farmland. So they made it into farmland. They also removed some of those trees, but they planted new trees, for instance, like the plum orchard. And there's going to be a bunch of other little trees throughout the space. So people can terraform their environment, not just through creating empty spaces like plains, but also through creating artificial forests. There is a pretty popular theory that the Amazon forest in Brazil was actually a bunch of orchards that all slowly grew and got out of hand over a couple thousands of years. So a forest can come not just from nature, but can come from human intervention. And that is really the point of what I'm talking about. Think about terraforming not just as something that you're doing, but how would the people of your world want to terraform? How would they want to make their rivers bigger or smaller? How would they want to build canals and dams and ditches? How would they want to build mounds to make their castles look taller and more defensible? All that stuff is stuff that we do in real life that we don't often think about people in Minecraft doing because, of course, it's a fake town. There are no people, but we can imagine that there are. We can imagine the types of things that they would want to do. I'll give you a small example. Apart from doing all this flattening of farmland here, I've also put in a small embankment. Basically, this was originally just a low sort of plain area, and my issue with that is that I knew that it was going to flood pretty regularly, so I wanted a bit of space so that these houses here, especially these two, wouldn't constantly be flooding, so I added in this little embankment. But it's not meant to look like it's just there in Minecraft, it's specifically something that the people of this world have thought about. They don't want their houses flooded. Talking about the people of this world, I want to talk a bit about culture and economy. So I'm lumping these two together because they're pretty much world building, but they're things that you should not be world building in a document, but world building in your physical world. If you're doing culture, you have to start with a bit of a basis, so you're either going to be researching or inventing a culture, probably both. The important part of this is how your world reflects that though. What sort of habits and rituals are made evident in your world? One of the rituals that I have here is that there are churches, of course. But if you're doing, say, an Islamic build, you would definitely want to have a lot of places to clean yourselves, a lot of public baths and fountains and stuff like that. So your sacred spaces are really important, but you also should be trying to show social relations. So how do these people get along with each other? In this world, there is a lot of the implication of war. So there are a lot of battlements, there are stone walls, and over here we can see that there is a border made up of an earthen mound that divides the quiet vale from this section here. So the fact that there is a gate here and there is a border has an implication about the social relations of the world. You can also talk about traditions. They have glass blowing, they have music making. That purple house over there, if I can zoom in, is going to be the house of a minstrel. So there are artistic traditions here. There's also going to be weaving and tapestries and banners and all that stuff. So these are all traditions that you can show through physical things. It's not just that I can say that, oh, they have a musical tradition. Like there's a house and a pretty important one. You can see it's up nearby the castle and the church for somebody who makes music. On the other hand, you can also show things like animal relations. So in the Middle Ages, especially, a lot of people lived in the same buildings as animals. They wouldn't necessarily live side by side with like a chicken or a cow because that's gross and unsanitary, but they would live in the same sort of general building. And I'll show a good one here. So here we have a building with a living space for people, and as part of the same building, there is an area for animals. This space here is also for animals, and it's part of the same kind of structure here. So you can see that they're not necessarily living side by side with animals, but they specifically have animal relations that are different to other places in the world. And the last thing I want to talk about is ruling structure as part of culture. So again, one of my issues with Regensburg and with a lot of my other cities like Cerneville, Newport, and Medina are that there isn't a clear structure for power in those cities. On the other hand, I've tried to remedy that here by putting a huge castle. So clearly indicating what kind of ruling structure is happening in your settlement is one way that you can talk about culture. If you want to go further into it, you can imagine, well, how are rulers decided? Is it democratic? If it's democratic, you probably want like a big town hall, temple, community center area where people can vote. Is it that the king always chooses their son or their daughter? If you're going off of something like male preference primogeniture, i.e., always choosing the oldest male heir, then you're probably going to want to have a pretty important space in your town or in your castle for whoever that male heir is. Talking a bit about economy and the way you can world build through that, well, every place is going to have a couple of necessary jobs. Now, one of those is farmer, and there are a lot of farmlands here. This is something I've specifically tried to improve from, again, a lot of my past builds. Regensburg, Newport, Saint-Neville, all of those are places that don't really have enough farms to support themselves. But of course, there are jobs that are less necessary, and this is where we can talk about the division of labor. The bigger a town gets, the more specialized jobs you will have, like the minstrel that I mentioned earlier and the glass blower, but also a butcher. You wouldn't necessarily need somebody to butcher meat if you're only like 12 people. You can probably butcher your own cows and stuff. It's not going to be that big of a deal. But if the whole community needs somebody to be butchering their meat, all of a sudden you have a butcher in town. And the bigger your build is, the more complex its economy is going to become. Speaking on the complexity of economy, you can also talk about education. So are there a lot of apprenticeships? Is there some kind of school? These are concepts that I talked about previously when I talked about culture in my dedicated video on that. But education and working conditions and stuff like that, how are people treated? How are educated people treated versus uneducated? What kind of education is available? These are all things that will start to become bigger and more pressing questions as you try to develop your idea of what the economy of a place is. And the last thing you can think about are your imports and exports. And this one is pretty simple. If you have a bunch of farms, they're probably exporting food. If you have only like one or two, they're probably importing food. If you have a really rare profession, like a glass blower, they're probably exporting glass. And if you're missing something basic, like there's no tailor in your town or there's nobody who makes clothes, then they're probably importing clothes. You can actually show this in your world in a pretty simple way, and that is through wagons. So again, imagine I put a wagon coming into town here, and I have it fully laden with a bunch of wools and fabrics and stuff. That implies that the economy of this place is importing a lot of wool. If on the other hand, it's turned in the other direction and it's full of wheat and beets and stuff like that, then obviously that implies that we are exporting food. So these are just some of the concepts that I'm trying to incorporate into this build to improve over my last builds. I'm thinking a lot about places like Newport and Regensburg, and I'm trying to really think about these four big ideas: movement and motion, density and space, terraforming, and culture and economy. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave a like and comment if you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.